Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we condense the latest academic research, systematic reviews, and conference proceedings into the essential insights you need to be thoroughly well-informed.
Today, we're undertaking a critical mission. We're looking at a huge shift in how we think about food and health.
A really monumental one. We're going deep into the conversation around ultra-processed foods.
And the whole idea here is, well, it's a radical evolution in how we think about nutrition.
Right. Because for decades, a century even, the guidance was all about single nutrients.
Oh, absolutely. We obsessed over fat grams, total sugar, whether your carbs were simple or complex. It was a very, reductionist way of looking at things.
Exactly. We were stuck asking, is there too much fat in the diet?
Yeah.
Or, are carbs the enemy this week? But that whole framework, it just wasn't enough.
It really wasn't. It couldn't explain the huge crises we're seeing now, the rise in obesity, traditional food cultures just vanishing, and all these chronic diseases popping up everywhere.
So the argument now, which seems to have more and more evidence behind it, is that the key thing isn't just what is in the food.
No, it's how that food was made, the degree of industrial manipulation, the processing itself. That's the new focus. That transformation is what we're looking at.
And our mission today is to be completely comprehensive on this. We've pulled together material from major nutritional conferences, exhaustive systematic reviews, and a really seminal Lancet series on this topic.
We're going to unpack the NOVA system, which is the tool that makes all this research possible.
Then we'll track the global consumption trends, and some of these numbers are, frankly, shocking.
And then we'll get into the mechanisms, the biological and behavioral reasons these foods can cause harm.
Before finally scrutinizing the debate, because this is a really vigorous, polarizing concept in the scientific community.
It's a dense and, I think, a crucial area of study. The data suggests we're dealing with a fundamental crisis in our global food systems. So let's unpack this.
Okay, let's start at the foundation then. The tool that all this research is built on, the NOVA classification system.
Right.
And it's important for you, our listener, to know that NOVA is not an acronym.
No, it's just from the Latin word for new, but it absolutely represents a new perspective.
Because it completely changes the lens. It's not defining foods by their nutrient breakdown.
Not at all. It's defining them by the extent and really the purpose of their industrial processing.
Okay, so what does that actually mean, industrial processing?
It's broadly defined as all the physical, biological, and chemical methods that are applied to food after it leaves nature, before we eat it or cook with it.
And NOVA divides everything into 4 groups based on that.
Exactly. 4 distinct groups along that processing gradient.
So group 1 must be the simplest form, the sort of gold standard for health.
Precisely. Group 1 is unprocessed and minimally processed foods. These are foods as you'd find them in nature, or maybe they've been altered in very simple ways.
Simple how?
Only to preserve them, really. Things like chilling, drying, freezing, pasteurization, maybe a simple fermentation, or just, removing the inedible bits.
Right. So this is where we find all the staples, your fresh and frozen fruits, your vegetables, whole grains like rice and oats, cuts of meat and fish.
Milk, plain yogurt, and basic drinks like water, coffee, tea. The food is still recognizable. The key is that its structure is intact.
I see. Okay, what's next?
Next is a necessary category. Group 2, processed culinary ingredients.
So the things you cook with.
Exactly. These are substances that are extracted from Group 1 foods or from nature directly, and their whole job is to be used to prepare or season other foods. You'd almost never eat them alone.
So this is my pantry. Your vegetable oils, butter, sugar, honey, salt.
Starches, lard, all the essentials for cooking. They enable meal preparation, but they are fundamentally different from Group 1.
Got it. Okay, moving on to group 3. This is where we start to see some combination, some real processing.
Yes, but it's still quite simple. Group 3 is processed foods. These are basically products made by adding Group 2 ingredients, salt, oil, sugar, to Group 1 foods.
And the methods are still pretty traditional.
Very. There are things you could do at home. Preservation methods like bottling, canning, or non-industrial curing.
So something like canned vegetables in brine or fruits in syrup.
Right. Or cheeses, which are just preserved milk, salted nuts, even freshly baked bread from a local bakery, made with just flour, yeast, salt, and water.
The key is that the Group 1 food is still the star of the show. It's identifiable.
Exactly. Which brings us to the big one, the category that's triggered this entire global health conversation. Group 4, ultra-processed foods, or UPFs.
And these are fundamentally different from the other three.
Fundamentally, they're defined as commercial formulations. They're not really food in the traditional sense. They're made mostly or even entirely from substances derived from other foods.
Derived how?
We're talking about cheap fractions from high-yield crops like corn or soy, combined with a whole host of additives. They often contain little to no intact Group 1 food at all.
So what's the defining purpose of a Group 4 food then, if it's not preservation?
The purpose is entirely different. It's profit. They are engineered to maximize profit, shelf life, and what they call palatability. They're explicitly designed to displace traditional, freshly prepared meals.
So this is the crucial part for anyone trying to apply this in a real-world grocery store. What are the markers? What's the shortcut for spotting a Group 4 item?
Okay, so you should look for two main things. The first is the presence of industrial substances you would never or very rarely use in your own kitchen.
Give me some examples.
Things like hydrolyzed proteins, whey protein isolate, high fructose maize syrup, maltodextrin, or industrially modified fats like intersterified oils.
Those words sound like they belong in a lab, not a kitchen.
That's because they do. They're industrial building blocks. Another one is mechanically separated meat. That's a huge red flag.
And the second marker?
The second is the class of what are called cosmetic additives. These are things added purely to make the formulation look, feel, and taste good.
So they're compensating for the lack of actual food.
Precisely. This includes things like flavors, flavor enhancers, emulsifiers, artificial sweeteners, colors, bulking agents. The rule of thumb, according to the research, is if it has even one of these specialized cosmetic additives, it's almost certainly ultra-processed.
And this covers that whole spectrum of modern convenience foods.
The whole thing. Mass-produced packaged breads and buns, soft drinks, margarine, packaged snacks, instant soups, reconstituted meats like hot dogs and nuggets, sugary breakfast cereals, those fruit yogurts.
It's a long list.
It's a very long list, but the fundamental difference is the goal. Group 3 takes real food and makes it last. Group 4 takes refined ingredients and additives and creates a product designed for maximum profits.
Okay, so with that Novia framework established, researchers could finally start testing their big hypotheses.
Right. And the first foundational one was this, that the ultra-processed dietary pattern is rapidly displacing long-established diets, diets centered on whole foods and actual cooking.
And the sources point to Brazil as the first place where this was really proven.
Absolutely. They have these amazing national household budget surveys going back to the 1980s, and the trend was just crystal clear.
What did they see?
Well, purchases of traditional staple foods, things like rice, beans, fresh meat, they started to decline. But the really critical part was that purchases of Group 2 culinary ingredients,
The oil, salt, and sugar for cooking.
exactly, those also decreased significantly. At the same time, purchases of UPFs, soft drinks, industrial cakes, packaged snacks were just shooting up.
And that drop in the Group 2 ingredients,
Yeah.
that's the smoking gun, isn't it?
It is. It proves families weren't just swapping one food for another. They were spending less time and money on cooking itself. The prepackaged product was replacing the entire cultural practice of making a meal.
And this pattern, first seen so clearly in Brazil, is now happening all over the world.
All over. And it's led to these staggering differences in consumption. It's heavily skewed towards wealthier nations, but it's happening everywhere.
Let's put some hard numbers on that. What are we seeing in high-income countries?
Okay, so in the United Kingdom, UPFs account for about 56 to 57% of total energy intake.
More than half of all calories.
More than half. In the USA, it's even higher, around 58% for adults. But if you look at U.S. children, specifically from age 12 to 19, that figure climbs to a truly shocking 67% of their total energy intake.
67%. 2/3 of the calories for American teenagers are coming from these industrial formulations.
That number alone should be a massive public health alarm bell. It shows just how deeply this dietary pattern has penetrated.
And it's not just the US and UK.
No. Canada jumped from 24% back in 1939 to 55% by 2001. And even countries we think of as having healthy diets are seeing huge shifts. Spain went from about 10% to almost 30% in just 2 decades.
What's really fascinating, though, is seeing this happen in real time in middle and lower income countries.
You can see the acceleration. It mirrors the growth that happened in the U.S. decades ago. So Brazil, for example, went from 10% in the late 80s to 21% by 2018. Mexico from 10% to 23%.
So while the total amount is still lower, The speed of the change is much faster. They're catching up.
They're catching up very, very quickly. You can see this really clearly in the commercial sales data as well.
Right, the Euromonitor data that tracked sales across 93 countries. What did that show?
It confirmed this acceleration in developing economies. The regions that started with lower consumption Africa, parts of Asia, they're showing the highest rates of increase.
Any specific numbers on that?
Yes. In a group of 22 lower middle-income countries, per capita sales of UPFs increased by 40% in just 15 years. That's a jump from about 45 kilos per person per year to over 63 kilos.
So the global food industry is systematically saturating these new markets where traditional diets are still common.
It appears so. And every single UPF subgroup they tracked, from candy to reconstituted meats, saw its sales volume increase in those regions.
But what about the high-income countries, where consumption is already through the roof? Did sales finally plateau or drop?
They mostly stabilized. But you have to look closer at why they stabilized. The slight overall sales decline was almost entirely due to a big drop in sales of just one single subgroup.
Let me guess. Sugary drinks.
Sugary carbonated drinks, exactly. And that reduction is almost certainly thanks to things like soda taxes and marketing restrictions.
That's if you take out the effect of those specific policies.
The underlying consumption of all the other UPFs, the snacks, the baked goods, the ready meals, that all stayed stable or, in some cases, even went up a little.
Which just reinforces the point.
Yeah.
Once this diet is established in a society, it is incredibly difficult to get rid of.
Incredibly. The overall trend is just inescapable. Global consumption is rising, it's displacing traditional diets, and the whole process is accelerating fastest in new markets.
Okay, which brings us to the next big hypothesis. Hypothesis 2.
Right, and this is that exposure to this ultra-processed diet isn't just about eating different food. It actively degrades your overall diet quality and introduces this whole stack of harmful characteristics.
Let's start with the most obvious one, the nutrient profile. Are diets high in UPFs just worse for you nutritionally?
Consistently, yes. Systematic reviews across 13 countries all confirm it. As UPF intake goes up, the overall nutrient quality goes down.
In what way?
You see a much higher intake of the things linked to chronic disease: total energy, saturated fats, total fat, and especially free sugars.
And at the same time, the good stuff disappears.
It plummets. You see significantly lower consumption of crucial things like fiber, protein, potassium, zinc, magnesium, and a bunch of vitamins.
And it's not just that the UPFs themselves are poor. They actively push out the good food.
They displace it. One analysis found that when UPFs made up 75% of calories, the share of whole foods like fruits and vegetables dropped from over 12% down to just 4%. It's a double whammy.
Okay, so the nutrient profile is bad. We can call that junk food. But this is where the research really goes beyond that simple idea. It gets into behavior and the actual physical structure of the food.
This is where the famous NIH randomized controlled trial comes in. It's a landmark study.
Tell us about it.
So they took 20 adults for a 2-week crossover study. They were either on an ultra-processed diet or a minimally processed diet. But here's the critical part.
What's that?
The researchers chemically matched both diets for the calories they presented, for the macronutrients, protein, fat, carbs, and even for the fiber and sodium. And people could eat as much as they wanted.
Wait, hang on. So the nutrition labels, if you will, were basically the same for both diets.
Essentially, yes. This was not a study comparing a high-sugar diet to a low-sugar diet. The only major difference was the degree of processing.
And the result?
It was astonishing. The people on the UPF diet spontaneously ate about 500 calories more every single day.
500 calories. That's a whole extra meal.
A whole extra meal. And over 2 weeks, they gained nearly 1 kilogram of body weight, specifically fat. Then when they switched to the minimally processed diet, they lost that same amount.
That's a staggering finding. It means the processing itself, completely separate from the nutrients on the label, is what's changing our appetite. How? Why did they overeat?
Well, they identified a few key mechanisms. The first one was the eating rate.
They just ate faster.
Much faster. UPFs, because of how they're made, have this soft, low viscosity texture. The food matrix has been pulverized, so it takes fewer chews to swallow a calorie.
So you're eating so quickly that your body's full signals can't keep up.
Exactly. The gut hormones, the brain signals, they just don't have time to register that you've had enough energy. You short-circuit your own satiety system.
Wow. Okay, what's the second mechanism?
The second is what's called hyperpalatability. UPFs are engineered for maximum sensory reward. They have these optimized combinations of fat, salt, and sugar that our brains are just wired to love.
And this can override our natural signals to stop eating.
It seems so. It encourages you to keep eating even when your energy needs have been met. It's a deliberate design feature. Some sources even suggest that many common UPFs meet the criteria used to define potentially addictive substances.
So this really shifts the blame from, a lack of individual willpower to biological manipulation through food engineering.
It really does. And then there's the final huge area of harm, which is the non-nutritional stuff.
What do you mean by that?
The destruction of the food matrix and the introduction of what are called xenobiotics, or foreign non-food substances.
Okay, let's break that down. The food matrix.
Right.
Why is destroying that structure so bad?
Because the matrix is so much more than just scaffolding. It dictates how nutrients get released, how long digestion takes, how it interacts with your gut bacteria. Ultra-processing obliterates that native structure.
So even if the label on a UPF says it has added fiber,
It's not the same. That isolated fiber doesn't behave in your gut the same way as the fiber that's naturally embedded in a whole grain or a vegetable.
Right.
The functional benefit is just compromised.
and I assume the processing also destroys other good things.
Yes, many of the protective phytochemicals that are naturally abundant in whole foods get destroyed, which further reduces the diet's quality.
Okay, now let's talk about those xenobiotics.
Yeah.
You said these are contaminants we absorb just by eating packaged foods.
Yes, and there are two main streams. The first is contaminants that migrate from the packaging itself.
What kind of things?
Well, UPF packaging is designed for a long shelf life. That often means plastics containing things like phthalates and bisphenols or BPA. And really importantly, PFAS, the forever chemicals, which are used in grease-proof coatings.
And these are all known endocrine disruptors.
All of them, which means they're chemicals that interfere with your body's hormone system.
How do they do that?
They can mimic or block natural hormones like estrogen, leading to really profound changes in metabolism, fertility, and development, even at very low doses. And studies show that people with higher UPF intake have much higher levels of these compounds in their urine.
So the wrapper is literally becoming part of the food.
The delivery mechanism is part of the disease vector.
Yes. And what's the second stream of contaminants?
That's the stuff created during the processing itself. High heat, high pressure, extrusion. These common manufacturing methods can create toxic compounds,
Like what?
like acrolein and acrylamide. Acrylamide forms when you brown food, but industrial processing can intensify this dramatically. And these compounds are linked to oxidative stress and insulin resistance.
So you're getting a dose of toxins with your meal.
You are. And finally, there's just the sheer volume of additives, the cocktail effect of it all.
You mean all the emulsifiers and sweeteners and colors adding up?
Exactly. The Nutrinet Santé cohort study in France had striking data on this. High UPF consumers had a 2-fold increase in emulsifiers, a 3-fold increase in flavor enhancers, and a massive 5-fold increase in non-sugar sweeteners compared to people who ate very few UPFs.
And we know these additives can harm our gut microbiome.
We do, so that's another critical layer of systemic harm.
So you have this combined force of poor nutrients, enforced overeating, matrix destruction, and a cocktail of chemicals.
And all of that converges on the final central claim, hypothesis 3, that this ultra-processed dietary pattern increases your risk of multiple chronic diseases.
This is where the big picture comes together from all the systematic reviews and meta-analyses.
It really is. We now have what are called umbrella reviews, which pull together evidence from dozens of high-quality studies. And for several critical outcomes, the evidence is now considered to be of moderate certainty.
Okay, so let's interpret some of those risk numbers. When we talk about a summary risk ratio, or SRR, what does that mean?
It's a pooled estimate of the risk, comparing people with the highest UPF consumption to those with the lowest. An SRR of 1.0 means no difference. Anything above that means increased risk.
So let's start with the biggest one, mortality.
For all-cause mortality, the SRR for every extra 50-gram serving of UPFs per day was 1.02, a 2% higher risk.
Which sounds small, but when almost everyone is eating these foods.
The public health impact is enormous. For cardiovascular disease, the risk was between 4 and 5% higher per serving. And for cerebrovascular disease specifically, things like strokes, the risk was up by 34%.
What about metabolic issues and cancer?
Type 2 diabetes showed a really concerning link. A 12% higher risk for every 10% increase in your calories from UPFs.
12%. That's significant.
It is. And for colorectal cancer, which is strongly linked to diet, there was a 4% higher risk for every 10% increase.
And beyond these really certain outcomes, the reviews found links to a whole host of other problems.
A huge range. a 21% higher risk for overweight or obesity, abdominal obesity, hypertension, but also things you might not expect.
Like what?
A 23% higher risk for depression, and some of the highest risk increases were for inflammatory diseases like Crohn's disease, with up to a 90% increased risk for the highest consumers in some studies.
The fact that it spans metabolism, inflammation, and mental health, it really supports that idea of a multi-system burden.
It absolutely does, and it's important to frame the size of these risks. They're often comparable in size, just in the opposite direction, to the protective effects you get from a very healthy diet, like the Mediterranean diet.
So the harm is as big as the benefit from a good diet.
Exactly. Which raises the big scientific question, is this just correlation, or can we actually infer that this is causal?
Right, because most of these are observational studies.
So researchers applied the famous Bradford-Hill criteria, a set of 9 principles used in epidemiology to build a case for causality when you can't do a massive, decades-long randomized trial.
And did the evidence for UPFs meet these criteria?
It strongly supported 7 out of the 9. Things like consistency, we see the same risk in different countries and populations, strength, the risk is big enough to matter. Temporality, the UPF exposure comes before the disease. And a biological gradient, more UPFs equals more risk.
And the plausibility is there from all the mechanisms we just talked about.
The plausibility and coherence are strong. And, crucially, the experiment criterion is met by that short-term NIH trial, which showed immediate causal weight gain. That's the slam dunk.
You said there's one piece of evidence that's even more powerful than that.
Yes. The mediation analysis insight, this is maybe the most crucial finding.
Why is it so important?
Because researchers tested the idea that the harm was just because of the high salt, sugar, and fat. So they did advanced statistical adjustments to control for those nutrients.
So they tried to make the salt, sugar, and fat levels equal in their models.
Exactly. And the startling finding was that the harmful links to chronic disease and mortality often remained statistically significant, even after they adjusted for those bad nutrients.
So even if a UPF diet had the exact same amount of salt, fat, and sugar as a whole food diet, it was still linked to worse outcomes.
Precisely. This is the definitive confirmation that the harm isn't just the poor nutrient profile. It points directly to all those other mechanisms: the food structure, the eating rate, the additives, the xenobiotics. The processing itself is the vector of harm.
Okay, so with this mountain of evidence, you'd think this would be settled science, but it's not. It has generated a huge amount of controversy.
A massive amount. It's a scientific and policy battleground. And it's important for you to understand the debate. If the evidence is so strong, why is there so much resistance?
Let's get into the key challenges then. The first big one is about the system itself: precision and classification.
Right. Critics argue that the no-VA definitions are just too crude and broad. They say grouping a fortified, whole-grain, ultra-processed bread in the same category as a can of soda just lacks scientific rigor.
They think it's too blunt an instrument.
Too blunt. They'd prefer much more detailed systems that categorize foods by specific ingredients and processing techniques.
Then there's the argument that this focus ignores the good things industry does, the nutritional adequacy critique.
Critics point out, correctly, that many fortified foods, which are often processed, play a huge public health role. They talk about folic acid fortification in flour, which basically wiped out neural tube defects. They argue that just telling everyone to eat unprocessed food isn't enough to meet all our nutritional needs.
And what about the more dramatic claims, like the idea that these foods are addictive?
Critics really push back on that. They challenge the idea that there's some unique quasi-addictive effect in UPFs. They say hyperpalatability, that pleasing mix of fat, salt, and sugar, is something humans have sought out for millennia.
So they're saying it's not really an addiction in the clinical sense.
Right. They argue that attributing a substance-based neurobiological addiction to these foods outside of specific disorders like binge eating is just not supported by the current evidence.
And finally, what about the idea that this is all the fault of big, evil, transnational corporations?
That's the globalization driver critique. Critics say focusing only on the huge multinationals is wrong. They have data suggesting that small and medium-sized local businesses are actually the dominant suppliers of processed foods globally.
So it's not just a Western diet being forced on the world.
They argue that up to 90% of processed foods in some regions are part of the local food economy, that the shift is being driven by local economic development, not just foreign companies.
Okay, that's a very robust set of counter-arguments.
Yeah.
How do the proponents, the researchers behind NoVA, respond?
Well, they acknowledge that UPFs are a diverse group. They agree a fortified bread is better than a soda. But they fall back on the general rule
Which is?
that the ultra-processed version of any food category, yogurt, bread, whatever, is consistently worse than its minimally processed counterpart. It's nutritionally inferior, has more additives, it makes you eat faster. The system works because it identifies that general pattern of industrial formulation.
And what's their answer to the criticism about not having long-term gold standard RCTs?
They argue that those kinds of trials are just not feasible for entire diets over decades. It's unethical and impossibly expensive. They say the combination of the strong observational data, which meets the Bradford Hill criteria, plus the powerful short-term NIH study, is more than enough evidence to act.
And despite this whole academic debate, policy is already starting to move forward.
It is, decisively, especially in Latin America, where they saw this trend hit hard and early.
And Brazil is a leader here.
Brazil is. Their official dietary guidelines have a golden rule. Prioritize natural, minimally processed foods and fresh meals over UPFs. And they explicitly consider the cultural and social importance of cooking.
They've also put this into practice in places like schools.
Exactly. Brazilian school feeding programs have really strict rules. They limit the budget for processed and ultra-processed foods, and they outright ban things like soft drinks and industrial cakes for all students. For kids under 3, all UPFs are prohibited.
But the most visible policy has probably been the warning labels.
Absolutely. The front of package warning labels. This is the PAO Janmal, which was pioneered by countries like Chile, Mexico, and Uruguay.
These are the big black stop signs on the front of packages.
The black octagons, right. They warn you if a product is high in sugar, fat, or sodium. And Mexico even went a step further and has labels that warn about artificial sweeteners.
And are these policies actually working?
They seem to be, especially when they're combined with other things. Over 40 countries now have sugary drink taxes. And in Chile and Mexico, that combination of taxes, warning labels, and marketing restrictions led to real drops in sales, a 24% decrease in Chile and about 8% in Mexico within 2 years.
So we have this clear battle line, strong evidence driving policy in one direction, and then ongoing scientific criticism, and, of course, massive corporate influence pushing back.
And that corporate influence is still the single biggest obstacle. They use intense lobbying, they fund research to question the science, they stress their economic importance. All of it directly conflicts with the public health goal of reducing UPF consumption.
So to synthesize this whole deep dive,
I think the core message is that the evidence is now very robust. The global shift towards ultra-processed foods is strongly implicated as a central driver of our chronic disease crisis. And the harm goes way beyond just calories or bad macros.
right, we've seen it's this complex mechanism. It involves behavioral manipulation that leads to overconsumption, the degradation of the food matrix, and the intake of xenobiotics like endocrine disruptors from packaging, plus that whole cocktail of additives.
The problem is systemic and it's engineered. And the public health imperative, based on the consistency of the evidence, is clear. Action is needed, especially in places where this diet isn't totally dominant yet.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the learner, to consider. A new way to think about this. If these foods are expertly designed to bypass satiety, maximize profit, and minimize the effort of eating.
How can we counter-engineer our own behavior?
Exactly. And the source material mentioned a simple pilot study. The participants didn't track calories or nutrients, they just focused on reducing their UPF count.
Just the total number of ultra-processed items they ate each day. And that simple, low-effort metric led to a significant drop in their total calorie intake, and they lost weight.
So if tracking grams of sugar or fat has largely failed to turn the tide, maybe the most effective thing we can do is behavioral. Maybe it's about actively replacing these industrial formulations with whole foods that require more cutting, more chewing, more connection to the food itself.
So could tracking the number of UPF items you eat this week be the most actionable goal of all?
That is definitely something to chew on.
Indeed. Until next time.
This has been The Deep Dive.